So, Professor McDonald has talked about anatomical models as a way of understanding and teaching anatomy, and we've seen quite a few examples of these with Evi Numen's talk. And I want to look at a particular type of anatomical model that came to huge popularity in Italy in the 18th century. So, this is contemporary with both of the Hunter brothers, and this is the model in wax. And I've had a particular fascination with wax anatomical models since I first started working at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow more than 20 years ago now, where they had quite a wonderful collection of Ziegler embryonic models. So this is actually one that's in Surgeons Hall collections, but I first encountered them at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow, where I was also lucky enough to see William Hunter's gravid uterus casts that Professor McDonald's been talking about every day as well. And today I want to particularly focus on one particular practitioner of anatomical cerebroplasty who was an 18th century woman. So that's quite unusual in itself. But the fact that anatomical waxes began in the Italian states shouldn't really come as a surprise. There was a long history of anatomical excellence there. The first modern day sanctioned human dissections took place in Bologna in 1315. And this is the city where Anna Morandi will be based. Italy was also where Leonardo da Vinci was carrying out his dissections, and obviously while Vesalius was Flemish, he produced his great De Fabrica in Padua, as we've heard. And one of the things about Italy, which I can say very, very confidently, sitting in Scotland on a sort of autumnal day where there's a chill in the air, is that it's a wee bit warm. And we've heard from Dr. Chaplin that dissection season in London ran from late autumn to early spring. In Bologna, because there was no refrigerators and things would get smelly quite quickly, dissection season was 2 weeks, the two coldest weeks of the year. And that coincided with Carnival. And so during the time, the public anatomies would be attended both by students and by carnival revelers. There would be music playing, there would be wine, and they were functioning not just as education. And I've always wondered, I mean, this is a picture of me standing at the dissection theatre in Bologna, how much you're actually going to be able to see, if you're seated around this quite a distance away, how much you're actually going to learn about the details of anatomy in this kind of scenario. So these weren't just education, they were also entertainment. They were also a kind of morality lesson as well. The people who were being dissection had just been very publicly executed before being taken to the dissection theatre. So this was meant to show the rewards of crime, as will become very explicit in Britain with the Murder Act in 1752. So we can see that in Bologna, a city that's famous for anatomical study, the ability to learn from cadavers was still remarkably limited. And the idea of replicating dissection wax comes from somebody we've already heard about from Evi, which is Guillaume Denou. He was working in Genoa with a Sicilian wax modeler called Gaetano Giulio Zumbo. And Zumbo had already produced a series of teatrini, little theatres, for Cosimo de' Medici, the Grand Duke of Tuscany. And he was a melancholy man. He wanted these teatrini to show death and decomposition. And this is a detail from one of the teatrini. You can see them in La Specola in Florence today, which is really showing bodily decomposition. But his partnership with Denou produced some beautiful anatomical waxes. Only 2 of them survive. And we've already seen this chap from Evi today. This is in La Specola in Florence. There's another anatomical head in Paris. And they are fabulous. They're gloriously beautiful things where you can really learn about anatomical structures. And so these show the potential for wax to reproduce dissection. They came to be called flesh for the wise, anatomy without the stench of putrefaction. And back in Bologna, Archbishop Prospero Lambertini, who in 1740 will become Pope Benedict XIV, is casting his influence. He wants his city of Bologna to be restored to a place of anatomical excellence, because he believes that to study anatomy is to study God's greatest creation, man. And he's seen these anatomical depictions in wax of kidneys by a man called Ercole Lelli. And so he commissions him to produce two spallati, flayed figures, for this lecture theatre, dissection theatre that we've already seen in the Archigymnasio. So here are Lelli's spallati. They're made of umbrella pine. There is a question mark of how much Lelli actually did the carving of these himself, but they are wonderful, and they do lead Pope Benedict XIV to commission Lelli in 1742 to create an anatomy room, a Camino dell'Anatomia, for the newly founded, by Italian standards, Institute of Science there. It's only been around about 30 years, as opposed to the university, which has been around since the 11th century. And it's got a reputation for being a more research-based place of learning, as opposed to the more sort of didactic, just kind of theoretical teaching at the university, which was getting a reputation for stagnation by this point. And so this is Lelli's anatomy room, as you can see it in the Palazzo Pughi in Bologna today. And if we just look at some of the figures, these are all full-length figures. And they're really trying to represent the perfection of God's creation. They use wax-impregnated fabric modeled over real bone, but not just from one skeleton. These are a jigsaw of bones that are being put together to try and create the most perfect proportions possible. And one of the people who was helping Ercole Lelli with his project here at the Institute was a man called Giovanni Manzolini. So you can see here, this is Lelli with his spallati behind him, and we've got Manzolini. They're roughly the same age, they studied together, but Lelli's got a bit of a reputation. He's hard to work with. He's already had two assistants walking out on him. He seems to rub people up the wrong way. And eventually this is what happens with Manzolini, who he seems to have known for quite a while. Manzolini felt that he was doing the brunt of the work without getting any of the credit. So in 1746, he walks out and he sets up a workshop in his own home, where he does the dissection, the teaching, and makes the models. And there he's helped by his wife, Anna Morandi. And Morandi's skill at both dissection and wax modelling will soon eclipse her husband's. Now, we don't know very much about Anna Morandi's early life. She was born in 1714, so less than 2 months before the founding of that Institute of Science, where her husband will go on to work with Ercole Lelli, and only a couple of streets away from it. She's 26 when she marries Manzolini in 1740, having met him while studying drawing and sculpture. And it seems likely that she was doing these kind of wax votives there as part of her study, because these were very, very popular in Italy at the time, often used, left in churches as a way of trying to gain favor, to get healing for somebody. So we can see that she's got that kind of interest already. And it's a time when helping out with the family business would have been a normal thing for a wife to do. The unusual thing is that the family business is anatomy. And that Morandi, a woman, becomes the public face of it. The Manzolini workshop becomes one of the places to stop on the grand tours of Europe. And it seems that nobody mentions Giovanni Manzolini. They talk of the lady anatomist. Her first biographer, Luigi Crespi, who's a contemporary of Morandi, talks of how students and anatomists had an almost insatiable desire to listen again and again to Manzolini's well-instructed wife speak, explain, and instruct with such learning. Now, Manzolini is described as having a melancholic demeanour, and it's possible that he was someone who we would describe as having a depressive illness today. And what we see is that both Luigi Crespi in 1769, while Morandi is still alive, and Michelle Medici in the 19th century attribute what Morandi does as being entirely through devotion to her husband. So you can see these quotes. This is from Luigi Crespi. With her vigilant attention to domestic affairs, her exemplary piety, and her constant encouragement of her studious, melancholy, pusillanimous, and afflicted husband, she was not only a source of every comfort and consolation, but with her talent and robust spirit, she was also a source for him of aid and support. She thought one day to work in the same profession of anatomy as her husband to assist and encourage him. And he goes on to say, forcing herself to overcome her repulsion, she began to dissect cadavers and make discoveries, observations, and incisions, finally becoming quite adept at this art. And then in the 19th century, Michel Medici says Giovanni Manzolini found timely and ready support in his woman, who tenderly loving him as she did, and fearing that he might abandon his esteemed works or continue with less desire and alacrity of spirit, devotes herself entirely to his comfort, not, however, with sweet and gentle words, but by herself becoming an anatomical sculptor. And as a woman in the 21st century, part of me bristles at these men attributing her success purely down to wifely devotion. But I realise that I'm bringing as much baggage to that conversation as they are. But we can see that having met her husband while studying drawing and sculpture, she already had her own interests in that side of the business. And even from a starting point of helping her husband, Morandi certainly goes above and beyond simple wifely duty. And what they're doing is very different from what Lely is doing. So if we look again at some of Lely's models, these are primarily focusing on bones and musculature. As I said, they had to have perfect proportions. This is more anatomy for artists than for medical understanding. And you can see how these compare to things like this statue of St. Bartholomew in the Duomo di Milan. He's flayed, it's showing the musculature underneath. And this by Il Sigoli in around 1600, Il Scotticato. Again, it's a flayed figure. And interestingly, this is cast in bronze, but this came from an initial red wax sculpture. So this is possibly one of the earliest anatomical waxes we know about. But if we compare that to what Morandi and Manzolini were doing, this is much more anatomy that you can study, that you can try and gain an understanding of what the anatomical basis of this is. So this is the muscles of the forearm. We can see here the muscles of the face. They were also particularly interested in something that didn't interest Lely at all. They were interested in the organs of sense. So this is a model of the ear. You can see the structures on the other side, around the back of that. And Manzolini actually published 2 tracts on the anatomy of the ear, which would supersede and occasionally correct the work of Antonio Valsalva, a Bologna-based anatomist whose works on the ear were the standard of the time. And while Morandi's name doesn't appear on Manzolini's works on the ear, it certainly seems she was involved in the dissection and the research. Her biography, Rebecca Messberger, certainly thinks so. That they were able to refer to Valsalva's work shows something else about them. They were taking anatomy very, very seriously. Their library seems to contain many of the major anatomical texts of the time, and they were able to actively engage with them. They weren't just trusting what those texts said, they were comparing that to what they were seeing in their dissections. And they had a lot to refer to. Morandi said that over 1,000 cadavers were dissected from their home, coming from the Hospital Santa Maria del Monte, where they were the bodies of the unclaimed poor. And then in 1755, Giovanni Manzolini dies. And Anna Morandi is left with 2 sons to feed and an anatomical workshop. She'd actually had 5 children over the 5 years that she was working with the time she was working with Manzolini, but only 2 of them survive past infancy. So the fact that she continues her anatomical work can be attributed both to her knowledge and skill, but also much more prosaically with the need to earn a living. But obviously, a woman in 18th century Italy doesn't get paid as much as a man, and so she had to place one of her children in an orphanage. Eventually, Pope Benedict XIV, who was a great supporter of women in academia at the time, awards her an annual stipend, and she carries on making even more incredible models, developing her own wax blend to better capture the structures she's realizing. And in 1760, the Bolognese Senate confer upon her the chair of anatomical modeling at Bologna University. But let's just look at some of what she's doing after her husband dies. There exist not only the models, but her own notebooks describing what she's doing and what she's discovering. And she certainly carried on looking at the sense organs and was one of the first people to describe the attachments of the inferior oblique muscle of the eye. She says, the oblique inferior muscle not only attaches to the nasal apophysis of the maxillary bone, as the authorities agree, but that with the bone open, one sees that the muscle proceeds and attaches itself to the lacrimal sac. This was discovered in my observations, and I have found it always to be constant. So this is showing that, like I said before, she's not just trusting the text she's reading, she's basing what she's learning on her own observations. And we can see from this text that she has confidence in what she's doing. She believes in her skill. And she produces tables like this, which show the muscles of the eye and how they work on the eye itself. And it's recorded in her notebooks that she actually made a giant eye 6-time life size, which is now lost. And one of the things that her notebook shows is that she also turned her very thorough organizational skills onto the male reproductive organs. However, most of the models relating to these studies have either been lost or in too poor condition for display. We can see some of her female reproductive organs, so a fetus and placenta, the uterus. And it seems that when you're getting into the 1760s and 1770s, she's really eclipsed the work of both her husband and Lely. She's receiving commissions in her own right. And she's getting invitations. She declines most of the invitations to visit other countries, but she does supply models for the Royal Society in London. Ooh. We can see here some models that you can see in the Science Museum in London today. She produces models for the King of Sardinia, for the Doge of Venice, and for Catherine the Great in Russia. And then in 1765, Count Girolamo Ranuzzi purchases both her and her husband's models, along with her library, her instruments, and her own private collection, while also giving her an apartment in his palace where she could live and work and teach. And one of the people who visits her there is Emperor Joseph II of Austria in 1769. Now, Morandi's fascination with the senses extends to the sense of touch. And we can see that here in this model, which is usually referred to as the feeling hands. The right hand is meant to be depicting the reaction to a painful stimulus. There had originally been a thorn branch in the model, which has since been lost. And these are often assumed to be Morandi's own hands. So that we can see her in her own collection. But we do get to see more of her than that, because she produced a couple of portrait busts. This one is of her husband, Giovanni Manzolini. It was made post-mortem, and he's there carrying out dissection. But she produces one of herself, a self-portrait. So this is Anna Morandi, and she's there dissecting that most important of organs, the brain. Apparently, conservation work took off a more artisanal cap that she was wearing, so she does look like she's in, quite a lot of finery here, but that's one of those things that's been lost over time. But I think we can see here that while Anna Morandi was recognised by many people across Europe for her skills and her knowledge, what we can see in this self-portrait is that she's recognising her own importance and skill and her own value in the anatomical arts. And I think that is really, really amazing to see in a woman in the 18th century. And this is a very quick overview of both of Italian waxes and the life of Anna Morandi Manzolini. If you are more interested in this, I would highly recommend these two books, The Lady Anatomist, which is Rebecca Misbarge's biography of Anna Morandi Manzolini, and Lucia de Com's Malleable Anatomies about 18th century Italian wax models. They're both phenomenal books. And a slight plug that I'm going to put in here at the end. Obviously, I work for Surgeons Hall in Edinburgh, and our current temporary exhibition, which is open to the public now, but we're only officially launching it next week, is called A Model Education, where we're going to be looking at the history of anatomical models and teaching. And while there isn't a Morandi Manzolini model in there, there are some utterly phenomenal wax models. I got very, very emotional seeing the Joseph Town when it came in as loan. We've got some things from the Glasgow Hunterian Museum in Cambridge, some beautiful papier-mâché models by the French physician Louis Azou. So if you are able to get to Edinburgh, I would definitely recommend that. And thank you very much for listening to me and for inviting me along to speak today.